Okay, guys, going to have a look at the effect of fatigue in regards to thermoregulation. Of course, thermo obviously is an indication for heat. VCAR, from VCAR's perspective, what do they want you to have an understanding about? We're looking at the acute physiological response to fatigue in the cardiovascular, respiratory and muscular systems. This is taken from pages 170, 181 out of your text. So addressing the concept of how fatigue itself affects your ability to manage heat. A couple of key things before we get underway. Obviously, hypothermia, we're talking about an increase in core body temperature. As you well know, core body temperature normally sits at about 36.7 degrees Celsius. So once it starts to get above that, 37.5 up to 38.3, you're said to be hyper, meaning above thermic, so increased core body temperature. And this is the point at which your body lacks the ability to disperse heat and as a result retains core heat, elevating core body temperature. And of course that has an increased core body temperature has an impact on a range of physiological functions, and it's quite complex, although we're just going to look at some simplistic ones now. A couple of other things. Remember, electrolytes are a reference to a whole range of different ions that involve or have an effect on cell function, but we're going to be looking specifically at the different types of salts. Having said that, we're going to look at a few other ions as well, like potassium, magnesium, and these things as well. It's important to keep in mind before we get underway that the exact mechanism of fatigue is actually not known. There's been, certainly through the last century and certainly the last half of the last century, lots of different theories suggested in regards to this, including lactic acid and lactate and hydrogen ions and these sorts of things, but again, which you'll have an understanding about. But again, the exact mechanism, we're not quite sure. I think probably the key thing to take away at the moment is we believe that it's really got to do with an accumulation of metabolites, and those metabolites then we believe interfere with energy production. And it's probably the best way to think about it, I think. Some of the effects of the thermoregulatory fatigue are things like elevated core body temperature, increased rate of dehydration. Increased rate of dehydration, redistribution of blood, and that has a significant role to play. Decreased plasma concentrations lost through sweating, elevated blood pressure, and again, it's got to do with increased heart rate due to a decrease in stroke volume. We'll look at that in a moment. Electrolyte imbalance and firing, and finally the decreased firing of the central nervous system. So we'll have a look at all of these as we go through. So all of these are the effects of thermoregulation or an altered thermoregulation due to fatigue. As I mentioned, elevated core body temperature. Once your normal core body temperature is around 36.7 degrees Celsius, once we start to creep up beyond that, and certainly once we get over, as I've mentioned up here, once we get over 38.3 degrees Celsius, then you're considered to be what's referred to as hyperthermic. Hyper means above, thermia means temperature. Keeping in mind that the major metabolic byproduct of metabolism is heat, metabolism being a measure of the number and rate of chemical reactions in your body, and a big byproduct of that, in fact about 80% of the byproduct of metabolism, about 80% of the byproduct metabolism is in fact heat. And so, of course, that accumulation of heat needs to be dealt with. We need to be able to get rid of heat for us to be able to function, to keep our metabolic processes going appropriately. As heat rises, then we end up with things like increased sweat rates. And of course, sweating is an attempt to convect or get rid of heat from the body. As we sweat, we actually lose blood plasma volume, and that has an impact, a physiological impact. So sweat obviously makes up a significant portion of your blood plasma. And of course, if you're losing sweat, then you're losing fluid, so you're losing blood plasma. Now that has an impact on blood pressure. And so in an attempt to try and manage that, the body then sets about increasing. So you end up with a decrease in stroke volume, because as you're losing the amount of fluid with each heartbeat, which is your stroke volume, every time your heart beats, it emits about 60 to 70 ml of blood each time. But if the amount of fluid in your bloodstream is dropping, then your stroke volume will drop as well. You won't be emitting or ejecting out of your heart as much fluid. So what the heart does to compensate for that, it actually increases its heart rate. And it does that to try and maintain what we refer to as cardiac output. So as a result, you're increasing your heart rate, so losing sweat, losing plasma volume, so increase your heart rate to try and maintain our cardiac output, which is given the symbol Q here. This then results in an increase in blood pressure. And the other thing that happens with sweating with an increase in heat, is that the body's going to try and get rid of as much heat as it possibly can. And so, of course, what it's going to do is it will vasoconstrict at the core, so decrease the amount of blood flow at the core, and then vasodilate at the skin surface. And the reason it's vasodilating at the skin surface is because it's trying to redirect heat towards the surface in an attempt to thermoregulate. So all of this results in less blood, and we talked about plasma concentration, less oxygen and fuel going to the working muscles, which are essentially at the core. And as a result, you end up with decreased blood flow, resulting in anaerobic glycolysis, and you know the effect of that. It also results in decreased waste removal and increased fatigue. The amount of amount of fluid that you lose due to sweat loss, has a significant impact on physiological function. If you lose 2% of your overall plasma volume, then you end up with things like impaired thermoregulatory ability. In other words, you decrease your ability to control your core body temperature. 3%, you end up with reduced muscle endurance. 4 to 6%, significantly reduced muscle endurance. But then finally, at 6 to 10%, you can end up with really extreme responses like severe heat cramp, heat exhaustion, heat stroke. And if extreme enough, death. So if you lose greater than 6, this should actually be 6 to 10% body weight due to dehydration, then you end up with extreme adverse responses. One of the other things that happens is you lose your electrolytes. Electrolytes are things like sodium, magnesium, potassium, calcium, and those sorts of things, which are really important in metabolic pathways. For example, down here, if you have a look, things like sodium and chloride have an important regulatory role in body water balance. Potassium significantly involved in glucose transport to the cells. Calcium involved in muscle contraction and relaxation of muscles, and magnesium as well. So with sweating, as you lose fluid due to sweat, then you end up with a significant electrolyte imbalance. And as I mentioned, that has a significant impact on these sorts of things down here. The other thing that happens is with fatigue, you end up with a decreased firing in the central nervous system. Again, the exact mechanism behind this, we're not quite sure, but fatigue generally just results in decreased metabolic activity. And of course, if you end up with decreased metabolic activity, then you're going to end up with a decrease in the amount of firing that occurs in the central nervous system. Just to mention about, I did mention electrolyte imbalance, but just another mention about the importance of sodium. Sodium, as I mentioned, has a significant role to play in things like regulating water balance and electrical impulses. And of course, if electrical impulses aren't occurring, then your ability to stimulate muscle contraction is also decreased. Mention this one, decreased firing of the central nervous system. That decreased firing, of course, results in things like fatigue due to decreased signalling between brain and working muscles, and also results in less frequent and forceful muscle contractions. So if we were to do a summary of all of that, we end up with things like hypothermia, increased blood flow to the skin surface, that's vasodilation, which I've mentioned here. Vasodilation. Also vasoconstriction of vessels at the core. Increased sweat rate, we know, results in fluid loss, which increases blood viscosity and thickness, and increased loss of electrolytes. Reduces blood volume, so we end up with decreased stroke volume, which results in increased heart rate. The effects of dehydration, impaired coordination, good decision making and concentration. And of course, what's the final impact on performance? Reduces intensity, results in earlier onset of fatigue, extends your race time, and decreases